Hey everybody, good morning. Welcome to today's Cathedra webinar. We are live on October 9th. For those who don't already know, Cathedra means learning in Creek. And in that respect, today we'll be learning about how to think like a reviewer from Diane Leonard. My name is Brooke Warrington. I'm the Training and Development Specialist here at the Native Learning Center. And we're so thrilled that you could join us this morning. Please follow along as I read the disclaimer aloud. This webinar provides a summary of fundamental concepts, requirements, and/or procedures within the allotted 90 minutes. The material discussed does not illustrate all possible scenarios that could be applicable. And something else to keep in mind, any materials presented are protected by copyright, trademark, trade secret, and other intellectual property laws and treaties. Before we get started, I want to familiarize you with some of the features available and how the environment works. So if you look at the top of your screen, you'll see an icon of either a person with their hand raised or just a hand. And know that with that icon, you can either raise your hand, agree, disagree, or step away. Now your screen should look similar to this graphic here. To the bottom left, you'll see a box that says Files. There is an appendix item in there for you today. You can download by clicking the arrow pointing downwards to download and save on your device. Once the item's downloaded, it'll appear in your device's download section. The second box to the right, labeled Web Links, is where you'll find our survey about today's webinar, along with any other links that'll be seen throughout today's presentation. And then finally, over to the right, we have a screen called the chat box. This is how you'll communicate with the instructor and the NLC staff. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to interact by using the chat box. Simply type your message and hit enter, or click the up arrow icon button to submit. We do encourage class participation, so feel free to write in those questions or comments. Know that tech support issues could also be submitted here. Know that most tech problems could be solved by simply exiting and re-entering the meeting room. Let's all try out the chat box together by typing in your name, where you're joining us from, and your tribal affiliation, please. All right, folks, and with that, it is with great pleasure that I introduce today's webinar instructor, Diane Leonard. And Diane, I'll hand it off to you now.
Thank you, Brooke. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank you for taking time to join me for our session, How to Think Like a Reviewer. As we're getting started, I would like to acknowledge that as we're delivering this session live today on October 9th, it is Indigenous Peoples Day. So I want to thank you for taking time to join me as part of this day to learn about grant seeking and how we can strengthen that work. And so thank you again for joining us. We've got a lot of content that we're going to be covering today. I want to give you just a quick bit about my background to help you understand why I'm delivering this session. My first professional love is all things grants. I started my career more than 20 years ago as a grant maker. I was the program officer, so a staff member for the Michigan Women's Foundation, a statewide foundation focused on women's and girls programming. And since then have served in a variety of roles, reviewers for other grant makers, on staff for statewide organizations, board members for nonprofits, and also then running D.H. Leonard Consulting and Grant Writing Services for the last 18 years. And in that time, that has resulted in more than $118 million in competitive grants awarded for clients. So none of that means that I have all the answers. I would never claim to make such a statement related to grants. But what it does hopefully indicate for you is that what we're talking about today is not theory, it is practical. And so as we're thinking about our topic and the fact that we're trying to think like a reviewer, what we're really doing is saying that whenever you put hard work into a grant application, before you click submit, before you send the email, before you put it in the mail, have you thought about it from the perspective of the reviewers? It's one thing to say that we have done our best work in terms of writing. We can have a beautifully written proposal that might not land as we would have hoped with a reviewer, with a grant maker. And so today we're going to look at the different content that will help us to sit in that reviewer seat, to put practices in place within our organizations that will ensure that we have done everything possible, not just to have a well written proposal, but to have a well written proposal that the reviewers learning about you potentially for the first time will be really excited and will clearly understand and want to advocate for you to get an award. Now, I will at the end make sure that we pause for any of those final questions that you might have. But I am watching the chat box live throughout our conversation today. And so I would really encourage you, if you have a question at any point during the content, please go ahead and put it right in the chat box and I'll engage in that question, cover it as quickly as I'm able. I also wanted to let you know that it is optional, but sometimes I will ask questions of you. It might be why for yes, N for no, or give me a quick word or phrase. And so when I ask you for something like that, what I'm asking you to do is to participate in the chat box. It is always optional, never mandatory. So as we think about thinking like a reviewer, as I mentioned, I have been a reviewer both on paid staff, in the review chair, on the final committee and board perspective. And so, what we're really thinking about is how do we wow our reviewers? There's that old phrase of knocking a reviewer's socks off, the idea that they are so excited that basically they can't do anything but say yes. So I want you to think about why grant makers would advocate for your proposal. What I would love to hear in the chat box, if you could please let me know, has anyone had the opportunity to serve as a reviewer for a grant maker? If you have had that opportunity, please go ahead and let me know in the chat box with a Y for yes. Being a reviewer for a grant maker is one of the best professional development opportunities that I believe a grant professional, a grant writer, a nonprofit professional who wants to focus on grants, I believe it's one of the best opportunities that we as individuals can take on because it puts us in that other seat. It gives us a chance to see what it's like to review. Okay, so I see that we've got some folks who have had the opportunity. I see the comment already. It's been eye-opening in a big picture way. If you have any other ahas, key takeaways that happened as a result of that experience, anything you'd be willing to share, I think that'd be really helpful. Each review experience is so different, whether it's at the federal level, state, city, for foundations, for a local United Way, a community foundation. Any of those opportunities have such a great learning opportunity for you in terms of what is it like when someone reads about an organization for the very first time. Now, what I will say is that one of my common threads, things I have learned being a reviewer for so many years, is that there is so much wonderful hard work that goes into proposals. And it makes it so that it is difficult for each and every grant maker to make final choices. There are always, truly, more proposals than there are dollars available to fund what has been applied for. And so that knowledge, wow, there is always work that is wonderful and could be funded, but is going unfunded in the process. That for me is always a good reminder of how important it is that we do everything we can if we're going to take time to sit down and write an application, write a grant proposal. How is it that we can stand out? What is it that we could do to potentially be the absolute yes? Because in each of the review experiences I've been a part of, there's always at least one proposal where there is no debate, no need for discussion. It's an absolute yes for those in the process, either because it was scored or by discussion. So let's talk about what some of those variations might look like. A few of you have had the opportunity to be a reviewer before. And not everyone has had that opportunity. So I'm wondering if you have been a reviewer, could you let me know? There's a poll that just came up. What did the process look like for you? So we've got a few different ways I think that grant makers have structured their processes. There certainly could be others. But if you have been a reviewer, let us know what kind of facilitation for the decision making process you were a part of. This is always fun when we do poll questions. I never know what's going to happen. What will be our answers? Okay, it looks like we've got staff facilitated. There were committees then making decisions. Okay, great. That's helpful because what we can see when we've done polls like this in other situations, the reality is there's no right or wrong way that a grant maker might structure a process. The federal grant seeking process is also very different from one agency to another or one program to another. The 5 different types of processes for decision making that I have on the screen here are some of the very common methods, but I'm certain that there can be even more than what I have generalized on the screen. Now, why is that important for us to understand? Well, if we're thinking about who is going to be reading our work, and maybe how many layers of committees and staff and boards might be involved in making our decisions, that helps us to understand the rules of the game that we're playing. What we're really trying to do is end up at the very top of the score if we're thinking that it's scored more like a test. We want to be that A plus. In fact, we want to maybe even get bonus points and be the A plus plus. If we're thinking about it for who's going to come out on top, it could be thinking more like there's a running race and we've got a whole group of people charging to the finish line and they're all doing fantastic, but there's just one that gets their toe across the line first, but then that whole next group that was running with them is still really good and might also be funded. So it's a whole big, like, wow, what's that front running group going to be in terms of who would get funded? There will be times when the process by which we are reviewed and considered is really unclear. We don't know which of these 5 types of review we might be in. And that's okay. It's unfortunate for us as the writer to not have clarity on the rules in which we are playing, but I believe that we can take from our past experiences and use those in order to strengthen our proposal so that whether we're in the second listed type of review or the fourth or the fifth, it won't matter. We will still have put forward our strongest proposal possible. So, what I would like to think about is those reviewers, regardless of what the decision-making process is like, what would it sound like? Why would a reviewer advocate for you? And it could be that they have the opportunity to advocate for you verbally in the review process. It could be that they have the opportunity to provide comments, maybe on a review scoring sheet about why they like your proposal, why they think it should be funded. So, some of the common reasons that reviewers are advocating for you, regardless of your program area, regardless of the size of the community that you're working with, reviewers will advocate for you if they are equally excited now about your work. If you have put forward your passion in the proposal and your belief in your own capacity to do the work you're putting forward, the reviewers are likely to catch on and to also be excited and to also believe, wow, this is indeed absolutely the best group to do this work that is proposed. Now, the third item listed here, reviewers will advocate for you if they believe, if all else were equal, that your proposal delivers more, a stronger return on investment than perhaps the proposal it's sitting next to in the review process. So, what I mean by this is that if you and another proposal, if you both requested, let's say, $25,000, and both proposals were really well written, the reviewers were excited about both, they could only fund one. What might be the tiebreaker in that situation? It might be that one of the proposals is talking about match funding So maybe using this grant award in order to leverage another funding source, or it could be not necessarily about leveraged cash, but about leveraged resources, access to maybe in-kind donations, in-kind valuation of time, but something that creates a stronger return on investment than air quotes only the $25,000 or whatever the request amount is in that particular grant application. So these are a few reasons that that reviewers might advocate for you, that they might speak up on your behalf and say, I think that this proposal would absolutely be a great fit for us. I think that we would be a great funding partner for them, right? We would be able to achieve our goal, our purpose as a grant maker through funding them to do their work, their mission, their programs, their services. Well, still, it sounds a little theoretical, doesn't it? And I know that not all of you have had the opportunity to be a reviewer. So I'm going to give you the opportunity to come into the review room with me. Now, in this room, what we see here on the screen, I'm the one behind the camera, your friendly grant professional, part of this committee. And yes, my fellow committee members did give me permission to take and use their photo. So what we see here in the room is that we have, from left to right, we have Kathy, a social worker for a local nonprofit organization. We have Dan, who's a CEO for a regional bank. We have Keith, who's a director of engineering at a large corporation in the community. We have Felicia, who's a land trust executive. And then we also have Heather, who works for a competing bank from Dan and is a mortgage broker in the community. So we've got 6 individuals, because remember, I'm there as well behind the camera, and we have been asked to review 5 different proposals. So we're community volunteers, and we have been asked to review proposals and make a recommendation for the board's consideration. Now, as I listed off their different job titles, it was unlikely that there was a common thread in terms of our professional experiences that would have made it so we were appropriate volunteers for a specific mission area. What is it that we think would be the link for these reviewers? Why would we all be in a room? Why would we be empowered to make these recommendations to a board? The reality is the geographic area in which we all lived and worked. And so you're right, that sounds an awful lot like most United Ways or community foundations. And the reason I like to use that as an example is because those are organizations that are often looking for community members to serve as reviewers and is a great way for you to first try to be a reviewer, a much lower barrier to entry than if you were to, say, go through the process to apply and be a reviewer at the federal level. So this is a very common first step for those who want to serve as a reviewer. Now, when we're all in the room together, yes, they did a great job in terms of bringing in some snacks and some coffee, etc., so that we would all be fueled and hydrated and ready for the discussion. And what did the discussion sound like? Well, we all had really different professional experiences and perspectives that made us ask different questions. And so, in a situation like that, what does it sound like if someone is advocating for you? Indeed, in that room, there was a proposal that became our absolute yes. There was no disagreement in the group that this group should be funded. The debate as the day wore on was about how much of their request could be funded, if we could fully fund them, or if we would recommend partial funding. But whether or not they were going to get funded was never a question. So some of the ways that the conversation went on in that room, things that sound like reviewers advocating for a proposal. So in one situation, Dan, the CEO for the regional bank, turned to Kathy, the social worker for a local agency, and said, I was wondering, is this feel attainable for the numbers that they're talking about, how many people they can serve, and the outcomes that they are expecting? Does that feel feasible? Does it feel attainable? Without even knowing the type of question he was asking, Dan was asking Kathy to weigh in on whether or not the objectives he was reading were SMART. So he was really thinking about that A, the attainable piece of the SMART objectives. And so the fact that Dan asked for clarification, looked for some local knowledge, looked for someone who had more expertise to weigh in and give him clarity, was so that he could decide, I think I like this proposal, but I'm not really sure, is this feasible? Is this appropriate? Is this the right amount? The fact that he spoke up to get that clarity is indirectly advocating for that proposal to potentially move forward. He wanted to make sure he had deeper understanding so that he could make a strong recommendation. So that's one example of a reviewer, by speaking up, is going to end up advocating for the proposal. Another example, Keith, the engineering manager in that photo, knew that I, as a past foundation staff member and as an ongoing grant professional, knew all sorts of information that many others in the room did not about IRS 990s and the different attachments and how they could be read and how stories could be understood from them. But also, he knew that I loved talking about grant budgets and that that was the first thing I reviewed in every application in any review process that I was a part of. And so he asked for my perspective about what we saw for an organizational deficit in a 990, so in that annual IRS filing, and what we thought about that compared to the program budget forward. Again, seeking clarification to have deeper understanding so that he could continue to advocate for what he thought was a great program. But he was just a little nervous about some of the capacity behind the scenes, and he didn't understand enough of the detail. Now, on the other hand, if reviewers are speaking up and saying things, I don't believe in their capacity, I don't understand what they're doing, right? That would be the opposite side, the more negative way that a reviewer might speak up. But the examples I've just given are examples of reviewers who are seeking clarification, getting further information so that they feel really excited and comfortable making decisions. So it's not that your proposal will be perfectly understood by all reviewers. There's a reason that the reviewers are in the room. In this case, the room was because they were passionate about their local community. So they wanted to do the best job possible with each and every proposal they reviewed. Now, as we think about those 5 proposals that that group was reading, they were for a wide range of programs and services across the county in which they would be implemented. They had different writing styles, different program areas, different missions, different SMART objectives. And you're right, they were all in the same structure, but there was no one perfect thing that any of them could or should say in order to guarantee that there was funding. Now, maybe there's a little bit more of a debate about artificial intelligence or AI and how that's going to be used in grant review moving forward. I'd say that's a big question mark in the field for how and if it will be used in the future. But for right now, since it is still people reading your proposals and people thinking about how to make grant awards for programs that are going to help people and environment and animals and communities, we're going to think about what are some of the generalized things we should not say in applications instead of trying to guess what might be the magic thing to say in applications. That's too funder specific, but to have a list of things not to say in grant applications, then I feel pretty confident in what we can look at today. Things that universally across different review scenarios, across different types of funding support, these are things that can stop your reviewers in their track and make them have unanswered questions that stop them from advocating for you. So the first of our 5, we are not sure how we will continue the program after your grant funding ends. Well, if we knew how we were going to fund the program today, tomorrow, in 1 year, 2 years, we wouldn't be here in the first place, right? So if we think about what this slide really means, what it is that we are trying to avoid, we are trying to help our grant makers understand not that we have funding figured out from here until infinity for our program. No, rather, we want our grant maker to know that we're gonna have a plan. In fact, we do have the start of a plan. If you can give us funding for this year, or for these 5 requested years, or for these 3 years, after the funding is over, our plan is to have third-party revenue. Our plan is to use a combination of individual donors and foundation grants. Our plan is to use a program income revenue model paired with applying to these 4 foundations that we have multi-year relationships already in place with. See how specific those examples were that I just quickly walked through? They give a reviewer a much deeper degree of understanding and belief in your capacity that the program or project would continue after the funding ends versus what you can see on the screen. So the more specificity that we can give to what our plan is for what is our best guess, our best laid idea for how we would continue after the grant funding ends is what I would recommend you place in your narrative instead of this statement. Our second item of 5 to avoid. We hope to be able to. In the chat box, what sort of language could we use instead of we hope to be able to? What sort of replacements would you suggest that we could make instead of we hope to? I'd love to have your perspective in the chat. What sort of wordsmithing ideas come to mind for you? We hope to be able to. There's nothing wrong with this statement. It's grammatically, we're assuming it's going to be correct after our ellipses. But what doesn't it do? We hope to does not give the reviewers confidence because you don't in this statement sound confident yourself. So, right, small wording choice. We will, we plan to, we intend to, very small changes. But that paired with the rest of your proposal where you're describing how you came up with your program design, how you evaluate, what you've learned in the past, that small language shift from we hope to more confident action language, we will, we plan, we intend to, gives the reviewers a much stronger degree of confidence in what they're reading. This is likely to be something that is subliminal for your reviewers. Occasionally, I've heard reviewers call out that they found language that didn't feel very confident to them, but usually this is something that is more subliminal in their reading. And so I would not want to in any way hurt my writing if I can be stronger and more confident in it so that whether they consciously think about it or not, we're coming across as confident. Our third item to avoid in our proposals, we need your funding to continue to operate. This is a different statement than the first one that we looked at. In fact, I was reading and working with a proposal just last week that had very similar language to this. We need your funding to help with our funding deficit. We need your funding to help with our funding gap. Those were phrases that this well-intentioned proposal was doing. And so I read it and I went, wait, why is a funder going to get excited about funding your deficit, funding your gap, helping you to continue to operate? So let me know in the chat box, what do you think a funder does care about? They don't care about you operating. They don't care about your funding gap or your deficit, not in this way. But let me know in the chat box, what are the things that your funder does care about? Oh, vision. Okay, yep, I like that. What else? Effective, sustainable programs. Awesome. I love that too. I'm thinking, oh, somebody took the words right out of my mouth in the chat box. Impact. So what I said to this individual, and they've been running this organization for more than 10 years, And they are at a point now where they are serving more than 3,000 students across the United States related to STEM learning a year. Like, funders don't care about your funding gap or your deficit. Funders care about the 3,000 plus underserved, under-resourced youth that you are working with and supporting each and every year. Like, that is impact that they care about. So instead of saying, we need your funding to continue to operate, let's spin it around. We need your funding to continue to provide these high quality, amazing, awesome services to these 3,000 plus youth each and every year. Do you hear how different that is? The statement was true. We need your funding to continue to operate. But that is not what will get reviewers engaged and help them want to advocate for you in the process. Now, this fourth one, it's a pretty long list, isn't it, of things to avoid. But the reality, what it boils down to is if we see words, phrases, or industry jargon, we want to avoid that because reviewers will have different understanding of what it means. And our use as an organization very well may differ from one to the next. Now, true, there are grant makers that will have funding programs that are called things like innovation grants. Well, if we are applying for an innovation grant, it is likely we will have to use the innovative word, and we should use the word innovative multiple times throughout the proposal, but we're explaining it. We're describing what does it mean. So this particular slide and what I'm encouraging you to consider is to not use some of these buzzwords in our industry unless you are giving clear explanation to what you mean so that there is no potential misunderstanding by the reviewer. Now, I will admit I have debated making a sixth item. So instead of having it be a list for like the 5 things not to say, I've debated about making a sixth slide because this last bullet that you can see on the screen, acronyms, tends to get a whole lot of conversation going. We'll see what happens here today. And so I feel like maybe acronyms do deserve their own slide, their very own part of our list here. So why would we not want to use acronyms in our application? Does anyone want to share in the chat box, why do you think, if we're thinking like a reviewer, why would you as the writer, as the nonprofit or the grant professional, why would you want to avoid acronyms? Let me know in the chat box what you're thinking. Why might we want to avoid acronyms? Readability. The reader could forget acronyms. Absolutely gold star. I once, in a review process, had 2 applications use the same acronym that meant different things. And I thought, is that possible? How could that be? So as a reviewer, it's like, oh, that was confusing. I had to keep flipping back and forth to where the acronym had been defined. Absolutely, I see in the chat box, not everyone knows the acronyms. Absolutely true. And so even if you define the acronym the first time that it's used in the proposal, which is true, yes, good best practice. Let's say that your proposal is 10 online questions long and you define it in the first of your online responses. Well, is the reviewer necessarily reading your online responses in the order in which you typed them into the form? Nope, can't assume that. They might be reading response number 3, and then 7, and then 10, and then finally reading number 1 at the end. But that's where you defined the acronym. So not everyone knows the acronym. Sometimes multiple organizations are using the same acronym, but in different ways. I get it. The reason we use acronyms in the first place is because the body of text might not have room for all the words or all the characters. So there are a few things that can, if you have to, use acronyms, make it easier so that you're not tripping up your reviewer, just like if you had used a buzzword or an industry jargon. I would argue acronyms are industry jargon, frankly. That's why I have it here on the slide. But what can we do? So we could, if we felt like we really had to use it in order to meet our space restrictions, we could define the acronym at the beginning of each individual online character counted box. So for example, and they know I love to use them as an example, the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. That is a lot of characters. That is a lot of words. Their staff will shorten it to NYCDOHMH. And indeed, that is a lot shorter. But pretty much no one ever remembers what the MH stands for. In fact, I just told you once, it's like you read it in a proposal once, NYCDOHMH. What did the MH stand for? Let me know in the chat box. What did the MH stand for? When we are writing with acronyms, even when we're defining it the first time it's used, we're asking our reviewers, who we really want to be focused on our impact, to remember details that are not critical for them to remember. And in the chat box, a very, very good guess, and the common guess by pretty much any reviewer. MH does not stand for mental health in their organization name. It is for mental hygiene. Now, in that case, it absolutely does not change your understanding of the proposal. But instead of having a reviewer try to remember what did that acronym mean, what could you do instead? In that example, you could do the health department. That could be what you shorten the full name to, so that in different spots in the text, instead of creating the acronym or any confusion, the health department, we have no questions. As we look at that list, that long list of our buzzwords, our phrases, our industry jargon, and those acronyms, I get it. The acronym is the biggest of the soapboxes that I got on, and it's in part because one time I was serving with a reviewer who said, I get so frustrated when I pick up a proposal that is full of acronyms that I put it down and I read it last. That is not what you want to have happen to you. All reviewers are well-intentioned and giving their best attention to all proposals that they provide feedback on, but being read last doesn't bode well. They may feel like they've already mentally committed where they're going to make their recommendations. They may be a little tired. They've been reading a stack of proposals. So we don't want to be put down and then picked up last. And here is the last of our 5 items, the things that we want to avoid saying. Don't make overly ambitious outcome statements. That's my broad statement for what we don't want to do. And here is an example of what that could sound like. We will eliminate childhood hunger in, let's pick a town. Let's pick, today I'm going to pick Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, if you don't mind. Okay, so we're going to eliminate childhood hunger in Philadelphia. Let's make some guesses here. In the chat box, how many zeros, literally, how many dollars is it going to take to eliminate childhood hunger in Philadelphia? Or maybe you want to think Atlanta or Dallas or Reno, Boise, Idaho, any large city. How many digits is it going to take for us to eliminate childhood hunger? Is it going to be, it's not going to be $1,000. It's not going to be $100,000. Maybe, I don't know, not for $1 million. $1 billion? $2 billion? A lot. I think that's what we can agree on. The answer is it would take a lot. And so if we saw a statement like this in a proposal that is to just about anyone except for the Gates Foundation, and we said, we're asking for $200,000 to eliminate childhood hunger in fill in the blank for your geographic focus. The funder's going to say, wait a second, that doesn't seem attainable. It doesn't seem that the dollar amount, your budget, is closely tied to the impact you're proposing to achieve during our grant award period. There's a disconnect. Now you might say, in part of what we are doing to eventually eliminate childhood hunger. Okay, we could couch it. But if we're looking at this statement by itself, if this is what we are saying is the impact we will create with the grant dollars, it takes so much money. It is not what you are usually asking for. I use this as a really big example. There are countless ways we could look at it in our own work. What you are trying to do is look at your outcome statements, look at your objectives. Are they attainable? Can they be achieved with the budget you have put forward for that grant? That's the way that you can double check yourself in any of your specific bodies of work to make sure that your outcome statements are not overly ambitious. So again, what you do is you look at your outcome statements and you ask yourself, can we really achieve this with the dollars that we have requested in our grant budget? So as we think about grabbing our reviewers' attention, we've covered things that we don't want to say, and that's in the writing area of our work, isn't it? But there's so much more that happens in terms of grant seeking best practices. On the screen, I have for you what is known in the field, so some industry jargon, as the grant life cycle. The idea is that these 5 items are continuously in motion in grant seeking organizations, and that they are in motion and in different spots for different grant makers you might be approaching at a specific time. So the way that we look at this life cycle and read this is by starting at the top in that 12 o'clock position as if we were looking at a clock on the wall. And so we think about readiness. Are we technically eligible? Before we move into research, so finding out information about funders that would be a great fit and doing our due diligence. We think about then moving to relationships, so having connections and making contact with grant makers. Not always possible, but especially when we're able to make contact, that will help inform our writing, which makes us highly competitive. And then our writing work, taking into account what we just talked about, those 5 things we're going to avoid, we're going to do all that so well that we get a grant award email, we get a grant award letter. And so we celebrate, and then we move on to reporting, to implementing, and to managing the grant before we start all over again. Now, for some, the grant life cycle language is newer in terms of industry jargon. It's been around for the last 3 or 4 years. What's been around longer than that is another way to think about those same 5 points. As you could maybe notice on that life cycle image, we have the R in writing capitalized. What that means is that we have 5 R's that are our grant seeking best practices. Same order, same words, 2 different ways to remember our grant best practices, so you can use whichever one works best for you. Now, as we're thinking about these 5 items, whether in our life cycle circle or in our straight list here with our 5 R's, where do we think we grab our reviewers' attention? Go ahead in the chat box if you don't mind. Please let me know which of these items is it where you think you need to focus on grabbing your reviewers' attention. Spoiler alert, there is more than one answer. So in the chat box, if you would be so kind to type which of these 5 items do you think is where you can grab your reviewers' attention? Go ahead and let me know what you think. Where within our 5 R's do we think we can grab our reviewers' attention? Okay, so we've got a vote for the first 4. So readiness, research, relationships, and writing. Another person says research and writing. Okay. I think that there are elements in all 5 that help us, but where we are actually in front of a potential reviewer, I would say relationships, writing, and reporting are more visible to a reviewer, and that's where they might recognize something. But it's through readiness and research that we're setting the stage for relationships, writing, and reporting. So any of the five could have been a great answer. Writing, though, the fourth, is where most people are usually spending time thinking about reviewers. The reason I ask you that question, we're going to walk actually through these in more detail, is that I don't want you to forget that all the other work you are doing surrounding the formal writing work is influencing how you are grabbing your reviewer's attention. So let's think about that research element. How two of you called out research as a way that we could grab our reviewers' attention. How is that possible? It is possible because by doing our research, looking at a funder, doing due diligence about what are they currently focused on, not what did they focus on 5 years ago or even 3 years ago, but what are they saying they're focused on now? Understanding where they are providing their funding geographically, understanding are they currently funding capital campaigns or not? Are they focused on collaborative proposals versus individual organizations? This is information that's going to help us eventually have some great relationship building conversations and also determine what is going to be the content and the focus of our proposal. So if we skip our research or if we shortchange our time on research, we potentially are going to miss the mark later on when we get to writing. When we're doing our research work, what I encourage you to do is to find all 7 of the points on the screen right now, not necessarily in this order, but if you find all 7 of these details when doing your due diligence using a wide variety of tools, we'll have the information we need in order to make decisions about what might our talking point sound like if we're reaching out to a grant maker. What questions might we have that we want to get answered so that we can write our proposal in the most competitive way? So these 7 items help us not only to make decisions about what we will apply to or not, but they're setting the stage for our relationships and our writing as we think about those next steps in our grant life cycle. Now, as you can see, number 6 and 7 are underlined. And the reason why communication preference and capacity and social media are called out on this slide with an underline is that these 2 items that we're looking for during our research are going to directly help us understand where and how, if at all, we get to make a first impression with a grant maker. So when I say relationships as it relates to grant makers, it is not always. In fact, it is rarely such a lovely personal relationship and connection that we're sitting down at a local coffee shop having tea or coffee or water, having a pleasant conversation together. Some may build to that, but usually it is more like meeting in person at a collaborative meeting or a funder forum or a conference, having phone calls, maybe just an email. All of those are appropriate for us to think about in terms of where we want to start a grant maker relationship conversation. And that conversation is created, what we're outlining for it is based on what we found during our research work. So something that I would encourage you to consider, because this is often our first impression with a grant maker, whether it's email, conference, funder forum, phone. This first interaction is indeed an impression that could be noted, could be remembered by a staff member or a board member who's going to be then overseeing a grant review process. This could carry through later on when your proposal is being reviewed. So what I would encourage you to do is to take the work of your research and prepare talking points. These talking points are going to make sense whether you are on the phone or whether you're using them as an email, or maybe you're preparing them so that you can give them to your executive director or another colleague who's going to be in person at a meeting or a conference with the grant maker. What I encourage you to include are these 3 points. So you want to be sure that you quickly introduce who you are, what agency you're with, and if it's a grant maker that is not from your local community or region, give them some quick context for where you are within the United States. You don't need to tell them necessarily that you're with a nonprofit. You don't need to tell them what year your organization was founded. A brief introduction, name, title, agency, and potentially some geographic context. What's really important out of these talking points is number 2. Based on your research, why do you think that you are a good fit? So when you were doing the research and you got excited, why do you think that you're a good fit? Ideally, you're going to practice that and it's going to come out to be about 30 seconds long. And then next, if after you share why you think you're a good fit, the grant maker says that I think that indeed could be a good fit. Great. Is it all right if I ask you, I've got just a few questions that would help us to think about writing our most competitive proposal? And they might say, sure, go ahead. So what you could ask, sure, questions that you might have about their process, something that's unclear to you, that if it was clarified would help you put together that competitive proposal. But what if you don't have any questions? Your thoughtful question could be to the grant maker. Dear grant maker, I was wondering if you could take a minute to describe a project that is either recently funded or currently funded that you're really excited about. Get them to talk about the work that they're so proud of and listen to the way that they tell the story. What they're doing is giving you ideas for how you might approach telling your story when it comes time for the writing work. So while you're focused on making a great first impression, listening to the funder talk about their work in their own words is going to give you some fantastic clues for your own writing work. But let's go back actually to number 2, if we could, for a minute, our 30-second elevator pitch. I'm wondering how many of you feel confident that you could deliver an elevator pitch about your work in 30 seconds or less. Go ahead and let me know in the chat box. Y for yes, M for maybe if you'd like, N for no. How many of you think that you could deliver an elevator pitch about your work in 30 seconds or less? Oh, and hashtag no judgment because 30 seconds is really fast. Okay, already I see we've got a mix of responses. Could you do it or not? So this is optional homework. I can't really assign homework in a learning session like this, so it's optional. But what I encourage you to try every time that you find a funder that you're interested in, before you reach out, make your notes about why you think you're a fit, and then time yourself or ask a colleague to time yourself and see what it sounds like. Maybe you start actually with a minute. When we do grant writing, like a relationships 101 class, usually actually we start the timers at 1 minute. And I'll have folks turn to their neighbor and I say, okay, everybody, and they have to like pretend that they're on the phone. So sometimes they hold their cell phone to make it feel more real. Pretend you're talking to the grant maker and introduce yourself and tell them why you're a good fit. You don't have to worry about the questions in that minute. And lots of folks will run over that first time. So we practice. All right, let's do it again in a minute. Second time round, what happens? Most people make it in a minute because they've thought about what is the key information that they want to get across. And once they've made it in the minute, the pair that they're with will then say, but what questions, what things did I really want to know or felt like you should have covered that were unanswered for me? So that's some really nice feedback, something that if you had space, if there's something you could trade out, maybe it would be more important to know how many youth you have been serving as opposed to how many years you've been in existence, right? So you could get suggestions for a trade-off in that short period of time. So having a minute, oh, that would be fantastic if we had that much time on the phone. But let's practice it again then and try for the 30 seconds, which some of you felt confident that you could do. The reason I like you to start with that minute and then shrink your time is to pay attention to what you cut. What you ended up with is the most critical information that you want your reviewers to remember. So if they read your entire proposal and maybe they don't remember a single programmatic detail, it's complex. They've just learned about it for the first time. but what is it that you would want them to turn to another one of their peers and be able to talk about? Oh, did you read this proposal by this group? They're doing amazing things with youth in STEM. That's what you want to be able to have happen, is for them to turn and quickly parrot, what is it that makes you unique? What is it that makes you stand out? What is it that makes you a good fit? So verbally practicing, we found that that makes for a clearer picture of what you are writing towards when you get to the proposal versus reading all your written work and then wondering, what did I have a main message? Did I get there? Now, this idea, this, as I said, is optional homework. But I also want to make a book recommendation that is a much deeper dive into this idea. It's called Find Your Red Thread, Make Your Big Ideas Irresistible, and it's by Tamsin Webster. And this book is a great way to, at a much, like I said, deeper level, to think about how you might talk about your main idea, your main point. We've just put the link there. Thank you so much, Megan, in the chat box. Yes, it's a link to Amazon. Please do support your independent local bookstores. But this is a great book that does take this idea, as I said, much deeper. But this is optional homework for you to try, not just when we're done with today's session, but to think about how you could use this as practice each and every time before you would go and reach out to a grant maker. Now, not all grant makers are going to allow us to contact them. And so while we're worried about first impressions for those that we can reach out to in person, on the phone, over email, we also have to be thinking about the many grant makers who will not, by their process, allow for us to reach out. So, what instead is going to be our first impression? It is going to be the actual proposal. So, I'm wondering, I know we have a few of you who have served as reviewers in your career thus far, but even if you have not yet served as a reviewer, good news. You have an opinion here too. So I would love for everyone to share in the chat. If you were reading someone's proposal and you had not spoken to them before, what in a proposal would make you smile? Go ahead and let me know in the chat box. What in a proposal, if you're reading it for the first time, if you know nothing about the organization that has written it, what might make you smile? This is your opinion. There is no right or wrong answer here. This is about you as the reader. What would make you smile? Go ahead and let me know in the chat box. I've got a short list going of things that make me smile, but well, that's my opinion. So I want to hear from yours as well. So I'll give you a brief second here to type that into the chat box. When we think about whether it's a portal or an email or truly like a hard copy mailed submission, right, oftentimes it's being received and there has been no contact in advance. We're not sure who's going to be reviewing it. We don't have any intel um, about what is meaningful to them in their process. So let's see, what are some things that are making you smile? Positive client feedback, great. Quantitative anecdotes, great. I think those are things that indeed could make many of us smile. What else? Here are some of the things that I have. Smart objectives. We talked about attainable earlier. Indeed, I love that, but I absolutely want to know my specifics, my measurable components, my time limited objectives. All of those will make me smile. Maybe it still is the funder in me from way back when, but if I'm reviewing a proposal that has followed the requirements put forward for the grant maker I'm reviewing for, absolutely that makes me smile. Let's see what else. You've shared resumes that contain hobbies will make you smile. So seeing those within your attachments, fantastic. Also, maybe if our ideas align and that comes through across the proposal. Oh, for sure. If you are helping to connect the dots for the reviewer, how our applications work is aligned with the funder's goal, for sure that can make someone smile. A few other ideas that I had, things that make me smile, concise narratives. Just because we had 4,000 characters doesn't mean you need to use all 4,000 characters. If you can do it in 3,200 characters, That's fantastic. Remember, reviewers are reading a stack of proposals, so if you can say what you need to in a concise, short manner, that is always going to make a reviewer smile. And lastly, I have don't leave them with unanswered questions. It is impossible for you to know all of the reviewers' questions that they may have as they learn about your very complex work for the first time. But to do our best to show our work, to give the level of detail that will help our reviewers understand our work, yes, we can do that. And the way we can do it, we'll actually talk about a process, a review process. That's actually going to be one of the best ways to avoid unanswered questions for our reviewers. So, foreshadowing, we'll talk about mock review here in just a few minutes. Well, if we use our research work and our relationship outreach, what will that help us do? That's right, it will help us pick up our grant application and write it in a way that is best structured for our reviewer. So if we're thinking about our application, the grant maker, the grant reviewers, it is their choice. It is at their discretion that they read the proposal in a specific order or not. I mentioned earlier when I was sharing the review story that I developed the habit way back when as a grant maker that I read the budget and budget justification first. And it turns out I'm not alone. There are many other reviewers that do the same thing. But in the normal ordering of a proposal, that's nearly at the end. So if I'm reading really out of order, and there are other reviewers reading out of order, your job is to think about how can you create a consistent story regardless of the order in which it's read. So yes, you might want to develop a habit of shaking up your proposal and reviewing it by hopping around a little bit like popcorn in the microwave. It's all over the place. Read your proposal out of order. What you want to end up with is an application, which is by itself. The application is a story. You want to ensure that the entire story is building on each other in terms of the elements that they are driving home that big idea, that main point that you would have delivered in your elevator pitch. As we're thinking about your story, I want you to remember that your application is the opportunity to take very complex work. That's right. Each of you, your organizations are doing really complex work that is new and different and distinct to a reviewer. They are definitely not the expert in your work. They might be an expert or more than dangerously knowledgeable in your mission area, but they are not going to be an expert in your exact work, in your exact community, in your exact clients. So you need to think about how to take your complex information and put it forward in an easier, I didn't say easy, but an easier way for them to digest. One such way, something that could help you write a compelling application, is if, and this is a big if, I get it, if there is the opportunity to put forward some sort of visual. Now, what I have here on the screen is a single message visual that's helping us to understand over multiple grade levels, over 2 different periods of time, and compared to a national average, what were we seeing for math scores? How did we see change over time? And wow, if you think about the amount of text it would take to describe what this bar graph is showing us, well, it's probably a pretty sizable paragraph, isn't it? And I mean, I love reading. I'm a voracious reader. But a visual like this, a bar graph, definitely helps me to understand the point you're putting forward than if you only presented it in text. So I encourage you, again, when formatting allows, to think about how it is that we can put forward something visual that will help our reviewers digest our very complex information, but to make it as singular in message as possible. Now, the original image of this bar graph actually has 2 subject matters on it. It has both math and reading. But I only want you to have one labeled figure when formatting allows. Sure, you might use reading a little bit later on in the proposal, but they should each be their own labeled figure. They should each be anchored within your text so that it is clear to reviewers how am I understanding your text and the visual, because our reviewers, they learn and digest in a wide range of ways, right? Just like we as individuals in a class, a learning session of any kind, we all learn and digest in different ways. Our proposal review is no different. Now, it might not be that we're using Excel, or maybe it is. It could actually be that we're using a super basic table. I've seen tables that are very well used, just like maybe 2 or 3 basic columns, 4 or 5 basic rows, calling out demographics that might have otherwise, again, been a really heavy, meaty paragraph. So maybe we have a lighter paragraph with the visual, and that helps to balance our different ways that reviewers digest our information. So what I wanted to call out is that sure, we could use Excel, we could use Google Sheets, of course, we could insert a table into our Word or Google Docs, but also there are some very basic infographic templates at Canva. That can be free for nonprofits. That's why I use that specific reference here. But Canva could give you the opportunity to create something visual that is singular in message. We don't want to throw in lots of bells and whistles and lots of data points. Again, we want to have it very singular so that it's an additive to the narrative that we've created. And as I mentioned, it's not required, and it is something where only formatting will allow in certain situations, right? Not all online portals will allow us to have any sort of visual. So as we think about our application and the components of it, things that help to make a compelling application that get our reviewer engaged, something I'd ask you to consider are logic models. I know, not everyone loves a good logic model. Now, we recognize their value, but it's not always where we're comfortable. Logic models help a reviewer to understand the program design that we have put forward. Logic models are at more like a 30,000-foot overview, I would say, compared to our work plans. So more proposals ask for work plans than logic models as attachments. What I want you to consider is what narrative questions are tied to logic models and work plan related content, even if it is not a required attachment. So having a logic model, so a visual representation of our program design, having a work plan, a visual representation of our key activities, having those agreed upon by our colleagues before we start writing, whether a required upload or not, gives us a strong shared understanding of a team for what we're going to put forward, what will make us compelling, what will give us as much information as possible so we can fill in all the blanks for our reviewers so that we can give them as clear of a visualization of our work as possible. Now, not everything is just about the writing. As I mentioned, I read the budget first. So when we think about writing a compelling application, what's going to make it stand out for a reviewer? For some, it's absolutely going to be the table or chart you put in your needs statement or in your program design section. For some, it might be the clarity with which you provide detail in your work plan. For me, absolutely. It is about the budget and how it tells a consistent story with our narrative. So, a few thoughts around that because my guess is that not all of you are responsible for designing grant budgets. In fact, could you let me know in the chat box why for yes and for no? Why for yes are you responsible for creating the grant budget? And for no would let me know you are not responsible for creating the grant budget. I never like to assume, especially when it comes to the who does the budget work, because it really is unique to each organization and your structure for your teams. Yep. Okay. And I'm seeing, just like I thought, wide range of answers. Both are great. No right or wrong there. But regardless of whether you are the person who creates the grant budget or not, you are still responsible as the person pulling together the application, making sure that the budget itself, maybe any justifications that might exist, tell the same story as the narrative. So it does not matter what form we are using. In this example on the screen, we've got a grantmaker form that's asking for total cost and amount requested. That same grantmaker wanted to know about revenue, what's committed, what's pending. Maybe you were handed this form and it was completely filled out. Wow, that's fantastic. Maybe you had to fill it out yourself. But what we are focused on is what is the story that is being told here? Are we asking for the entire amount of our project? Or are we just asking for part? Do we already have half of the funding secured from other sources and you, dear grantmaker, are the final piece? Those are important parts of our story. Maybe if we're back on the expense section, here's one example of how inconsistencies can play out if in your narrative you have talked about how transportation is a barrier for individuals accessing your services. And so you put forward in your program design that you as an organization are going to send the staff into the community. They're going to go right to clients' homes. Well, maybe if we're in an urban area, that might mean public transportation. If we were in a rural community, that would probably mean we were thinking about mileage reimbursement. Either way, if that was what you had put forward in your narrative, when we come into your grant budget form, we would expect to see in the total project expense section, in line 6 for travel, we would expect to see some amount of money, even if you weren't asking for it from that grant maker. In the amount requested column, we would very well expect to see travel costs in total project expenses. You'd set the stage narratively that it was a big deal. So when we get to the budget, we'd expect to see numbers. If there were no figures there, or it was something very small, like $100, that would be an inconsistency for the reviewer. They would not be sure which is accurate, the narrative or the budget, and they'd be confused. They'd have unanswered questions. It's a great example of how when we have unanswered questions, our reviewers, well, they might not advocate for us. As we think about that compelling application, I want you to step back for a moment. I mentioned what a love for reading I have. And so if you think about maybe your own favorite book, it could be fiction or nonfiction. If it's fiction, maybe it's historical fiction, maybe it's sci-fi, no judgment at all. But if you think about what kind of stories engage you, it's the entire story from first cover to back cover, right? The entire story is what engages you. If we think about stories as it is in our application, right? It's from cover letter through budget and attachments. Something I'd ask you to consider for some grant makers, for some reviewers, things that will help your application stand out are their success stories, their impact stories. And so maybe you're already using those in grant applications in your organization, in which case that's fantastic. For others, though, you might say, oh, I think that's a spot where we could be better, we could be stronger. So I'd encourage you to look in other areas of your organization for your fundraising, for your communication to your partners. Where are you talking about your impact stories? Is it in email appeals, annual donor appeals, social media? Look for other places you're sharing impact stories and think about how you could include them. Some proposals will have space, certainly not all. But those could be an extra bonus for how you turn that story of your entire application into something that will resonate with as many reviewers as possible. Well, but that is not the end. That is just the end of drafting, isn't it? We make it through our research work and then we use it to build relationships if possible. And then we spend most of our time in the writing process, but we are not done yet. We want to build in time within our project management timeline for one final step. And this final step before we click submit is called a mock review. Now, this mock review that we're about to talk about, this is where that downloadable file in the Adobe system, that's what this is related to. I'm going to talk about something called a mock review process. And the reason why I do believe I can safely speak for all of us in this room today when I say that we each want to win. We do not spend time writing applications for grant funding in order to get rejected. We want to win. Our organizations need the funding. And I don't think anyone likes to read or hear that there were more strong proposals than there were dollars available in this funding round. So here's what the goldfish have to do with this idea. The goldfish in the bowl on the left-hand side, those are fundable goldfish. They all could be great pets. They could all be amazing grant funding partners. And, I don't know if you've ever gone to a pet store and you've tried to like scoop out a fish from a tank with a little net. You're not real sure which fish you're usually going to get. But I mean, it's a cute fish. Any of them could go home. Any of them would be great. I hate to make that idea analogy to your grant proposals, but it's true. We've got a stack of proposals and they're all great. They could all be grant funded partners. We'll do our best, but I mean, any of them could be funded and we'd be happy. Well, you as the fish or you as the grant proposal, you don't want to leave it to chance. You want the funding. So what we are doing is developing this competitive muscle, it turns out, to leap to the bowl on the right. You will be the absolute yes. There is no doubt if you are the awesome fish that is swimming in the bowl on its right, on its own, you are going to get the funding. You are the absolute yes. So what is it that many of us already do in order to try and be the absolute yes? We ask for feedback. And we ask for feedback from colleagues who, despite the best intentions, sometimes only provide feedback that sounds like, oh my gosh, it looks great. I hope we get it. I do think you might have missed a comma in the third sentence in the fourth paragraph, but beyond that, it looks great. Let me know in the chat box why for yes. Is this the sort of feedback that you often get when you ask for feedback on a grant proposal? It is well intentioned and it does indicate that they read the proposal. So you do always appreciate it and you're grateful. But this does not help us increase our competitiveness. This ensures we have buy-in from our colleagues. You may have a very, very strong editor on your team. They've got a great red pen. They love to be in the suggesting mode in your document. And that also is fantastic, but that is copy editing. It's grammar focused, it's word choice focused. It is based on the opinion of the editor. That by itself is not going to make our proposal stronger. Instead, we want to think about mock review. So mock review is thinking about how we will be scored, how we will be judged, what will the review process be like. So the person or persons doing the review are thinking like the decision maker, not a copy editor. That is a very different feeling. Not all colleagues are happy or excited about judging each other's work, but we are indeed trying to mock up, to create a situation where we are thinking about in our guidelines when we see that we will be scored, like in this instance here, 1 point for need, 2 for target population, 7 for program design. That's an indicator we should try mock review because we're going to be scored based on points, and we don't want to miss any points. In this example, it says scoring tips to the right of the online character counted box. Also, again, an indicator we are going to be scored. So we should look carefully in the guidelines to find out how is our proposal going to be reviewed. Could we create a mock review? The way we would create a mock review, if indeed there is an indication of how we will be scored or judged, create a really lightweight scoring sheet, something that is 1 page, ideally even less than a whole page, so that people could write down their scores and their comments. Ideally, we're going to have 3 colleagues who did not help write the application serve as reviewers. This should only take them 30 to 60 minutes. But to be respectful of the rest of the commitments they have, we're going to let them know in advance when it will be conducted, and we will give them ideally 2 to 3 days to fit this review in with the rest of their work. Again, it should only take them 30 to 60 minutes. What will happen as a result is we will get back then 3 scoring sheets. We can take the averages of the scores that we have received and prioritize making edits on our lowest scoring section and then working our way backwards towards our highest scoring section if we still have time, making edits along the way, thinking about what feedback did we get, what score did we get, how could we make it a stronger response, not just for one reviewer, but rather for all the reviewers. So we're taking into consideration all the feedback from all 3 reviewers and trying to make a single response better for all, not just great for one. Now, this process needs a few disclaimers. It is different, absolutely different than what many organizations feel comfortable with. And so it is important to remember that you, as the writer, should not take the comments personally. Getting feedback on how to make text stronger for one reviewer is an awful lot like what it's going to feel like when you get feedback from a true grant reviewer. So I'm always grateful. I'd rather get the feedback now than after we've clicked submit, right? If I get the feedback now and can try and strengthen something, it's going to increase our odds of getting funded. And we also want to remember that when there are multiple voices in a process, we need to decide who gets the final say on what sort of feedback we incorporate or don't. So if there's, as I said, multiple levels in terms of voices or hierarchy involved, who gets the final say on what we would include or what we might make time to edit? To be successful, this is a big extra step. We're used to focusing on how do we get to the deadline so that ideally we don't submit the day of the deadline. But now, Diane, you're telling us that we should be not only preparing to submit at least the day before, maybe 3 or 5 days before, especially for federal work, but you want us to build in extra days for a review process? Whew, right, tall order. So we might, yes, you're right, have to create some false internal deadlines to move everything back so that we are building in space for this review process. Because the only way mock review can be meaningful is if what we put forward in the mock review process is a proposal that really could have been submitted. It could have gone into grants.gov. It could have gone into the state portal. It could have gone into that foundation portal, but we paused and we put it through our internal mock review process so that we could strengthen it and then still put it in the real application portal early. Now, I have heard from organizations over the years, sometimes they say, oh, I don't think we're going to do it. Our process is fine. Well, yes, could be fine, but is it truly optimized? Are you getting all of the grants that you write? Unless the answer is yes, there's always room for improvement as we try to secure more of the grants that we write. That's usually my response back. But really, the biggest concern is usually actually around timeline. So, how do we build that in? And so, it does take a slightly stronger project management muscle in some teams. It's not about judgment on what project management process you use, but it does usually take a good organizational muscle building workout in terms of how are we going to agree on fitting all this in when we're used to slightly different timelines and activities. So it does take some practice. So maybe you want to practice not on a huge federal grant the first time, maybe something smaller, like a foundation grant or something with a little more flexibility. So even when we do mock review, though, oh, I wish there was a guarantee that it would bring us funding each and every time, but it unfortunately cannot. Because as awesome as mock review is for strengthening proposals, it cannot influence the strength of the other applications and the relationships that they may already have in place. It cannot influence the initial understanding and background of reviewers. and it absolutely cannot influence if other proposals are getting priority or bonus points. So maybe mock review will help us get an A, but if priority or bonus points are available, it might not. There's nothing it could do to help us get an A+. So I'm encouraging you to consider trying mock review. Maybe you pick one proposal to try it on. Maybe you try 2 over the next quarter, the next 2 quarters. Regardless of which proposals you use the process for, there is well, it has to be optional as a challenge. I can't mandate. But if you happen to be denied, ask for feedback so you can get your scores, compare them to what you thought in the review process might be a weakness, and then continue to strengthen. If you use the mock review process and you get funded, after you are done celebrating, please ask for your feedback. Get your scores so you can validate, wow, that mock review was really accurate. I wonder how we can duplicate that in the future. So what will mock review actually look like? The answer is it will look very different for each and every application. I have just shown you some examples as I clicked through, and they were each a different structure. That's part of why we gave you the mock review guide, so that you could go ahead and have that as a base template that's right in your files in today's Adobe portal, so that you can get that and save it right to your desktop. You don't have to wait even for any sort of follow-up from us. So you've got that along with the slides as a result for today. Now, I'm guessing you might have some questions as it relates to mock review, but maybe you have questions about other parts of today's content. You've been fantastic in the chat box interacting throughout for the prompts I've given, so I would love to hear from you. What questions do you have? Let's see what we can get answered in the chat box now. But I also wanted to be sure to give you my contact information because I'm happy to answer questions at any time. I know personally, I'm always coming up with my questions after a learning session. The next time I actually go to use that information, right? It could be a week or a month later. I'll be like, oh, now I have a question. So I get it. You might not have a question until you go to design and use your first mock review to help you do that final stage of thinking like a reviewer. That's totally fine. Just drop me an email at any time. Or if you prefer, nothing else in your inbox. No judgment about that at all. You could reach out over LinkedIn. You could give me a direct message. That's also fine. But I think the basic point, hopefully you're getting it, is that I am absolutely happy to answer questions at any point along the way. And I'll keep an eye on the chat box here to see what you might have for questions today. And I do know that if you reach out to Brooke, you'll make sure that you get the slides for today so that you could have those as a resource as well, in addition to that mock review guide that we have in your file downloads here. All right, I'm keeping an eye on the chat box, but in the meantime,
All right, everybody.
Yeah, back to you, Brooke.
So much, Diane. That was such an incredible presentation. I know I certainly learned a lot listening to that. As I close out the webinar, guys, go ahead and keep sending in your questions for Diane into the chat. I've also gone ahead and launched today's survey for the webinar, How to Think Like a Reviewer. So if you wouldn't mind taking a moment to complete our survey, it really only takes about a minute or two, and your feedback helps us to do more of what's working and to improve upon what's needing it. And we invite you to be as candid as you like because our surveys are anonymous. And we hope you can join us for our next webinar, which is incidentally going to be on Friday the 13th. Get creepy with us. But it's actually going to be on if you get the money, do you know how to manage it? So this will be another grants writing, grant management focused webinar presented by Rosa McNally. This one will be back to our typical time for webinars at 2 p.m. Eastern. Just a friendly reminder that registration is free. And feel free to access this and any other recorded webinars online on our website, nativelearningcenter.com. We have a Catheta webinars tab featuring a recorded webinar section, and you could click on any of the webinars that we've done for the past 2 years in that section. So feel free to view those and share them with your colleagues. And please also check out our upcoming events posted to our various social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we even have a podcast titled Hopathanga Native American Podcast, where we discuss focused topics within tribal housing and self-determination. You can listen on Simplecast, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And you can even view the video recordings with our guests on YouTube. But once again, folks, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Indigenous Peoples Day, and we hope to connect with y'all real soon. It looks like, Diane, you're getting a lot of love in the chat. I'm going to hang back for a second to keep that chat open, but I am going to go ahead and turn off the recording.